Our Bible study today is on Revelation chapter 13, beginning at verse 11. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we look to you for understanding for the book of Revelation. May your Holy Spirit open our hearts and our minds to see the ways in which the world continues to reflect your punishment of sin, but especially your victory over it through your Son, Jesus Christ, who is the Lamb who was slain and has been raised to life and brings us hope even in the face of disaster and attacks by the devil. So help us to never be afraid, but instead to stand firm in faith in Jesus. In his name, amen. Okay, so the chapter 13 of Revelation is about the two beasts. And in the first half of chapter 13 is the beast out of the sea, which was summoned by the dragon, which represents the devil. So the devil was defeated in chapter 13, or thrown out of heaven. And since he couldn't destroy the woman and the child, which represents the church and God's people, since he couldn't destroy the church, he's going to try to attack Christians. So the offspring of the woman, which is mentioned at the end of chapter 13. And so the devil is the one who calls the beast out of the sea. And the beast out of the sea, we talked about last time, represents governmental authorities in opposition to God's people. So there's been lots of governments and human authorities that tries to blaspheme God. A lot of the pictures in the beginning of chapter 13 are all from the book of Daniel, right? So it had like the 10 horns and 7 heads with crowns on the horns. So the horn represents strength, like powers of governments, and then the crowns represent authority, so like kings. But these are authorities that are not based on divine power, right? So because the crowns are on the horns, so they're trying to legitimize the kind of power that governments use against humanity. And then the different beasts, the leopard and the bear and the lion, are all right out of the book of Daniel. And back in that section, it represented the Greek Empire, or maybe it was the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Or because I think the Romans was probably represented as just a special type of beast, like a conglomeration of the beast. So I guess that would be the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks. Yeah. So those are the beasts that are represented by the animals. And then when we get to the section that we're looking at today, we're talking about the beast out of the earth. And so the beast out of the earth is representing religious powers being used either to confirm like idolatry among governments, or to try to bring try to fool people into worshiping something other than Jesus, right? So because if it's religious, a lot of times people think that it's legitimate just because it's religious. A lot of people are duped into believing that any particular religion might be godly simply because maybe they see miraculous signs. I mean, even if you don't see the signs, there's religions that claim golden plates from heaven and specific miracles. Now, the scriptures that we look at also have those things, but the difference is that you had the people who saw it wasn't just like a couple people who saw the miracles from the Bible. Like when Moses parted the Red Sea, it was like all the people of Israel and all of their children heard the story. So this was like an entire nation of people who saw these miracles, as opposed to finding golden plates and translating them like the Mormons and stuff, and then they get taken up in heaven so no one ever sees them. But we'll see in this section here that it gives us a description about how there is this deception, because of course the beast out of the earth is also under the control of Satan. And we'll see at the very end of the section, that infamous number 666. Okay, so could someone read verse 11?
Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon.
So here, whereas the picture of the beast out of the sea was kind of scary, right? Because it had you would never see an animal with 10 horns and 7 heads, and then all these other aspects like a conglomeration of beasts and stuff. But here, this beast out of the earth, this is how would you describe it? 2 horns like a lamb.
Not scary.
There we go, not scary. Exactly. I mean, lambs are usually considered innocent, humble, cute. This is just something that nobody would be afraid of. But this is not the only description, right? That's just the first part. It says he had 2 horns like a lamb, but then he spoke like the dragon, right? So the dragon was pictured as Satan in the previous chapter. So this is like that wolf in sheep's clothing, the very thing that Jesus warned us about, right? So Jesus said to beware of false prophets, and I think it's like Matthew chapter 24. He warns against false prophets, and throughout the New Testament we see descriptions like this to tell us be careful of the things that the enemy would use to try to deceive humanity. So let's look at some of the passages. For instance, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9.
Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves.
Very good. Yeah, that was the passage I was referring to. I hadn't written it down, so it's Matthew 7, 15. Yeah. So Jesus warns us about those things, and then Paul also warns about that in 2 Thessalonians 2:9. Okay.
2 through 9?
Chapter 2, verse 9.
Because I even saw it in 3, verse 3. Okay, whatever.
Yeah, well, that whole section, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is about the man of lawlessness.
Okay, well, verse 9 says, the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays.
That's it? So, okay, in the NIV it says that, talking about the lawless one, so it's kind of like the Antichrist, he will work in accordance with the work of Satan displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders. And verse 10 says that in every sort of evil that deceives those who are perishing. So you have this description of these counterfeit signs. So miracles are not only something that God does, but we see that this is throughout the Bible. There were other groups that tried to do things. For instance, when Moses went to Pharaoh, the magicians in Pharaoh's court would also take like sticks, throw them on the ground, and they turned into snakes. But Moses' staff would turn into a snake, and it would eat the other ones, show superiority, and wipe them out. Let's see, the other passage I have is 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13 through 14. Okay, so this section is about false apostles.
What verses? Oh, 2 Corinthians.
2 Corinthians 11, 13, and 14.
For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, masquerading as apostles of Christ, and no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light.
So there it's telling us that the devil himself will appear like an angel of light, and so in the book of Revelation, it's warning us in this section here, of chapter 13, about the kinds of things that could deceive even God's people. The sign. Let's see, verse. Revelation 13.
11.
Verse 11. We were talking about the the dragon, speaking like a dragon. In verse 12, it says, "He exercised all authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast." So this is that. If we see this as kind of, as we get further down, it'll talk about religious things, that the beast of the earth is going to deceive people, but it'll point people to like an earthly authority. The beast of the earth is represented by religious authority, right? So it's going to be fooling people into worshiping something other than God. So it's like turning like a governmental official into like an idol, and it's kind of lending its authority. And I think of like a modern example is like the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. The patriarch of that church actually supports Putin's war efforts against Ukraine. It's like, how is that you're killing all these people, trying to take over a country that's independent. Sure, it used to be part of Russia at one time, but the people who are dying as a result of this desire to make Russia, or bring it back to like the Soviet power that it once was, is it's an action full of pride. How is the Christian church in Russia supporting that? Well, it's acting like this. It's like pointing people to, well, look, this is the person you should be listening to because he's great. He's our leader and stuff. So
It's like the pro-Hitler
yeah,
church in Germany
exactly.
during
So
World War II.
Hitler, the only people who were allowed to continue to serve in churches in Germany during World War II were those who signed onto the Nazi Party. If you didn't, you were arrested and put in jail. So the people who would be like the spiritual authorities, pointing people to the person who was the leader of the country, Hitler, then they would, point people to that person to listen to. So this is similar to what we read here in verse 12. "He exercised all authority on the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and all its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed." The fatal wound we talked about last time was that the beast out of the sea. Originally, it may have been a picture of Rome, right? So if Rome is attacking Christians as a governmental authority over them, saying, you can't. Well, originally they were like rounding up Christians for not obeying the law, which was to worship the idols, the pantheon of the Greek gods. And because they didn't do that, they were considered traitors. So they had broken the law and they were killing them. But then how did that so-called beast out of the sea, how did it get a fatal wound? Some people believe that was a description of how Constantine would become a Christian. So instead of being an enemy of the church, he became an ally of the church. So that would be a fatal wound for the beast, because the beast is not killing Christians anymore. Now it's on the side of the Christians. But we're not absolutely sure what it could be talking about. It could be that whenever governments are trying to destroy Christians or the church, that they're not going to be able to fully do it, because obviously Jesus has already won the victory. So there's always gonna be like a limit to that aspect of government authority over Christianity trying to stop Christians. And then the description here is that mortal, a fatal wound was healed. So then governments are attacking again, right? So when Rome fell, it didn't last forever. That governments weren't attacking Christians. It was just a few hundred years later that you had other nations rise up and become anti-Christian groups, like the Muslims attacked out of Saudi Arabia and took over all the Christian. All of North Africa used to be Christian. All the Middle East was Christian, and then after the 700s, it turned Muslim again, or it turned Muslim. And so those are the types of attacks by governments that tried to destroy Christianity. Yes, some people have identified the beast from the earth, which is the religious authority claiming the worship of an image being like a human authority. So that was during the Reformation, they identified the Pope as that person, right? So, but is the Pope the beast of the earth, or is he the beast out of the sea? And in some ways he was both, because he was both a spiritual head and he had the secular power to control the rest of Europe, because the Pope, all he had to do was say, if you don't listen to what I want, then I will excommunicate, the king. And then if a king is excommunicated, his entire country is excommunicated. Everybody underneath him is going to be punished. That means that the priests would stop giving the sacrament to everybody in, like, France, if the king of France disobeyed the Pope, and the Pope excommunicated him. Wow. So, and of course that would cause the people, they would have this existential fear of going to hell, so they would often rise up and riot against the king until the king did what the Pope wanted. So the Pope had a huge amount of authority. That type of authority really is, corrupts horribly, and so the corruption during the Middle Ages was extensive.
Where was that event?
Well, from the 1300s all the way through the Reformation, the popes had a lot of authority, but some of that started eroding. Actually, you can go back even further, like, from 500 on, right? So,
is that when the first pope happened?
Well, the Catholic Church calls Peter the first pope.
Oh, that's
So from the beginning, right? So they say it's a direct line from Peter all the way to the Pope we have now, and that each one is, in the same line.
so the symbolism for the beast is for which pope?
So when Luther was talking about it, he said that the idea that the church can control people's destiny by withholding forgiveness or selling it to people, right? So the whole idea is that they weren't giving freely what Christ had given to those who are repentant. Instead, they were selling it to extort people. So that was the sign of the beast. And so they didn't say, the reformers did not say that any particular pope was the beast, but it was the institution. Yeah, the papacy as an institution, because of the whole. Even the description of the papacy is that he's the vicar of Christ. That's what he calls himself. And the word vicar means the one who stands in for. So, in Anglicanism, a vicar is synonymous with the word pastor. In the Lutheran Church, the word vicar means a person who's preparing to become a pastor. But the word vicar originally just meant somebody who stands in for. So if the Pope is the vicar of Christ, that means he stands in for Christ. So he's like Christ on earth, and that's what the Reformer said is the exact description of the Antichrist, the person who stands in the place of Jesus on earth and tries to control people for his own benefits. And what kind of benefits would those be? Well, look at the Vatican, and it's like this huge palace. It was built. St. Peter's Basilica was. In today's money, it would have cost billions and billions of dollars, and it was extorted by the offerings of the people of Europe for decades by selling indulgences, which is the very reason that the Reformation occurred. And it's not always a fashionable thing to talk about. In the Middle Ages, the Lutherans had no problem condemning what was happening. Today, it doesn't sound so nice when you say, the Pope is the Antichrist, and yet when the Pope, yeah, it hasn't changed. What's actually changed is that their marketing is better. They don't use the word indulgences because that's a bad word. But when a person dies, they don't tell you you're going to go to heaven. You have to have a mass said in that person's honor. Why? Because they're going to be in purgatory and you need to get them out. And if you pay some money, so they still do have indulgences. That's why, people pay for baptisms. That's why people pay to have masses said for their dead relatives after their funeral.
But they pay for them even years later. They'll have
I know.
masses for 'em.
Yeah, they still do it because the person still might be in purgatory. The thing is, how would you know if they're still there? Well, because normally in the Middle Ages they would say that a person would be in purgatory for millions of years. So if you paid enough money, you could take off all that extra time. Which is strange because if you only live to about 80 years old on earth, why would you live for millions of years in purgatory? And how could you ever pay that off? And why would Jesus have to die on the cross if he didn't pay it already off? So, it doesn't fit with what the Bible teaches. And so that's the reason why the Reformation claimed that the Pope was the Antichrist. And so when we get to this section here, we're reading about the beast from the earth is going to look like Jesus, right? The lamb who was slain. But instead of being the real lamb, this is like an imposter. So someone taking the place of Jesus. Okay, and then verse 13.
It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people.
Okay, so what kinds of places in the Old Testament do we have examples of people bringing fire from heaven?
Elijah?
Very good, that's right. Elijah, back in 1 Kings.
The false prophets.
That's right. So, there was the burn up the sacrifice, and then they killed the false prophets because they couldn't bring fire from heaven, from the praying to Baal. So you've got, that's, sounds like the description that he's using, but, even Jesus' disciples tried to get Jesus to send fire from heaven. Jesus was preaching in the Decapolis, which is the Gentile areas near to the east of the Sea of Galilee, and some of the people rejected him. And Jesus' disciples said, "Should we call for fire down from heaven to punish these people?" And Jesus said, "No, that's not what I'm here for." He didn't come to judge. The first time he came as the sacrifice. And so it does say he'll return to judge both the living and the dead in the Apostles' Creed, as well as throughout the Bible, and especially the book of Revelation tells us that Jesus will return in judgment. But it says in John 3 verse 17 that Jesus did not come to, God did not send his son into the world to judge the world, but to save the world through him. But eventually there will come the time of judgment. So these miraculous signs are ways in which false prophets, and false prophets were warned against them throughout the book of Revelation. Revelation 16:13, Revelation 19:20, Revelation 20 verse 10 are the descriptions of the false prophet. It's the same image, but it's found several times, warning Christians to beware of these false prophets who are to come. And they'll do these miraculous signs. They might even cause fire from heaven in the full view of men. So this is something that would be very convincing. I mean, how many people would see such a thing and not believe, right? And yet, miracles themselves don't confirm or they don't change people to believe necessarily. When John talks about Jesus' raising of Lazarus, it says that the Pharisees who were there at the tomb and saw him come out, they didn't believe in Jesus. They just wanted to plot to kill him. So the miracles themselves won't necessarily do it, but it will cause some people to put their trust in the wrong thing. So how do we know what is right? And Jesus gave us warnings about in the last days there'll be false prophets who will mislead even the faithful, if that were possible, he says. And so his description there is like, the devil is going to try everything possible in order to destroy the church, because his hatred for Jesus is seen in his attack on those who belong to Jesus, right? And what did Jesus say about his people? He said, I will not lose any of those whom my Father has given me, right? And he talks about the parable of the 99 sheep, right? One wanders away, and he's going to go search after it. He's not going to let even one be lost.
That would be a person whose name is in the book of life.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting. If your name is in the book of life, you got it made.
That's right, but you don't know if your name is in the book of life.
You can't lose, right?
Right, but you don't know if your name is in the book of life.
Yeah.
And the people who, I guess you technically say, if these people were so easily fooled into worshiping the false prophet or the beast of the earth, then their names aren't in the book of life because they're worshiping an idol. And so were they ever Christians in the first place, right? And could we claim that they were Christians who were misled, or were they just always unbelievers? Those are questions that are based on the knowledge of the future that we don't have. So the only one who knows is Jesus, and so he already knows who belongs to him and who isn't. And his description was, "My sheep know my voice and listen to me." So in this point where people are false prophets and speaking with the words of the dragon, then they don't know the voice of the good shepherd. They're following somebody else. And so those are people who are not written in the book of life. They're not believers. And as believers, we need to warn those people, but we also need to be aware of for ourselves. We don't want to fall into the trap of following a false prophet. And those false and misleading idols in the world can both be governmental authorities, so it can be a political problem that can mislead people, and sometimes I think that happens with different types of religious nationalism. So I mean, like in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian leaders are in bed together, right? I mean, they basically support each other. One scratches the other one's back, right? And then in America, sometimes you see people claiming that, you're only a Christian if you belong to this political persuasion, and I don't think that's biblical either. We have to be aware of things anything that could divide us among each other. Instead of seeing people who don't have your same political views as you as an enemy, instead we should see that any kind of political ideology can be used to separate people and to cause us to see each other with this thought that a person's our enemy, because people aren't our enemies. The devil is our enemy, and people are tools of the enemy. So we got to be careful about that.
That's what's going on right now in America.
I know.
I mean, there's great divide right now.
Yeah.
To the point where you would shoot somebody because you don't like what he's saying.
And isn't that satanic? I mean, so you can see exactly what this. I think this is talking about a person who would allow their political viewpoint to lead them to murder. Is an exact description of what's happening here. It's worshiping the idols, worshiping the image of the beast, right? So the image of that beast might be a political ideology. It may not have been an actual statue, but in the Roman times they did have statues of Caesar, and if you didn't bow down to that image of the leader of Rome, then you would be killed. So in some ways it was literally then happening, and now it's more ideologically happening. But I think it's interesting to see it's very similar to what happened during the time of Elijah, where causing the fire from heaven. Okay, how about verse?
Even back to Elijah. Isn't it more accurate to say Elijah was able to get God to bring down fire?
That's right. Yeah. God is the one who did the fire, and
He's the source of the miracle, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, in fact, the Old Testament doesn't actually call those miracles. It calls them signs and wonders. So a sign points away from itself to the person, to the power. So Elijah wasn't trying to draw attention to himself.
No.
He was trying to point people to God. So that's a big difference, as opposed to here. Does it use the word miracle?
So how does this? Well, I'll call a false prophet or whatever, because I don't know what he is. How does he get fire to come down from heaven? Is God cooperating with him then?
Well, perhaps it's that Satan is a spiritual being that does have power, and that his power is never as strong as God, but he imitates or mimics the things that are true, right? So the idea that that you have, let's see. Well, the lamb is not here, and this picture is the beast out of the earth, right? But Jesus was pictured as the lamb on the throne earlier. So, which is the true lamb, right? And notice that this lamb doesn't say that this was the lamb that was wounded, but then came back to life. So the marks of Jesus are his crucifixion, whereas this lamb, he doesn't have any marks of sacrifice. Instead, it's all about like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Because he speaks with the voice of the dragon. Okay, verse 14.
Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived.
So there's that reference again to the to the healed wound, which was something about how the attacks on Christianity stopped. And so if that's Constantine, that's a pretty good example of that. But what about this idea of ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast? That sounds like Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar set up an image and said that whoever didn't bow down to it would be killed. And so that's similar to what's described, I think it's Daniel 3 verse 6, where he said that whoever doesn't bow down to the gold image would be executed, thrown into the fiery furnace. And here, let's see here. The idea that people could be deceived, that his goal, this religious authority that's pointing people away from Jesus and to the false worship that is something that John warned us about. So 1 John 4, 1 through 3 gives us a description about what we should be looking for.
Every spirit and test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. This is how you recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, but every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and even now is already in the world.
Yeah, so here John is, who also was the writer of the book of Revelation and the Gospel of John, had already been warning people about the very thing that he's describing in the book of Revelation. Now, I think that traditionally the dating of the book of 1 John is somewhere between 85 and 95, so it could have been before the book of Revelation, but it does show us that testing the spirits to know if something is of God is an important thing for the Christian to do. And that's not just so we can be safe, but it's also we can help safeguard another person's faith by warning them. Okay, so the beast, of course, tries to order, the beast of the earth tries to order people to worship an image. Okay, and in Revelation 13:15.
And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain.
So this is an interesting fact from history, is that a lot of like Greek or Roman temples would have idols in it, and either somebody would try to use ventriloquy, or they would be like a mouthpiece that would have an airway that would go into the mouth of the idol, and they would make it appear that the statue was talking. And so this is something that was recorded by Josephus and other Roman historians that described this practice. And people often believe that it was miraculous, which most likely it was probably people who were just pretending to do stuff.
Kind of like the Wizard of Oz.
Exactly. The Wizard of Oz is like a modern version of the same thing. That in the Apocrypha there is a story called Bel and the Dragon, and Bel is the name of the idol of the Babylonians, and the dragon they have a statue of this demonic figure that they said would come alive and eat the food that was offered to it. So people would bring the food in the daytime, put it in front of the idol. They would lock the temple, and then in the morning the food would be eaten. And so everybody thought that it was real. The idol came to life. And so Daniel, and so this is of course the Apocrypha. It was written after the time of Daniel. It was written in Greek, not in Hebrew. It was written after the Old Testament was finished, before the New Testament. But it is a interesting story that's supposed to have taken place during the Persian Empire. And so, I guess it's technically during the Babylonian Empire, because Nebuchadnezzar in the story believes that he asks Daniel, how do I know that your God is any better than the God of the Babylonians? Because he says, because the statue in the temple comes alive, and you tell me your God's alive. And he says, how can you prove it? And so he tells him that the God of Israel is the only true God, but this false God of the Babylonians was just trickery. And so he proved it, because what he did was he watched to see what the priests would do, and he found that behind the temple there was a doorway that went underneath, and so after they locked the temple, the priests would go in, take the food, and then take it out. So when people came into the front of the temple in the morning, they thought that the food was eaten. And so he showed the king the secret passageway and showed him how he was being fooled. So that's an interesting story that comes from the Jewish people, and it's just acknowledging the practices of pagan religions that use trickery to fool the masses. Marxism claims that all religions are like that all religions are tricking people into worshiping something that doesn't exist. But the difference is that, the God of the Bible never allowed any images to be made. So in the temple, there was no statue of Yahweh, right? That was considered idolatry. The first commandment, you shall not make any graven images unto the Lord, and you shall not worship an idol. So paganism has always tried to make a God in our own image, whereas the true God of the universe made us in his image. So, some statue is not real, even if they think maybe it's just a representation of something spiritual. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 that the idols, they aren't real, but there is something spiritual behind them, and it's demons. He says when you eat meat offered idols, you're participating, or you're having koinonia, which is the word for communion. You're having communion with demons. So he warns the people not to participate in that. Especially if another person's faith is in danger. He's saying, you who are holy and are mature in your faith, eating meat offered to idols is meaningless. It doesn't make any difference. It won't hurt you. But if it could hurt someone's faith, then you shouldn't do it, because out of love, we should always act towards the other person's benefit. We don't want to hurt another person's faith. So that's the same thing here, is that this beast is trying to order people to set up this image, to worship it, and here in verse 15, the power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. So who would be doing the killing? People who believed that this idol was either real or had some kind of spiritual authority, and then it's demonic because it's telling people to kill the Christians who refuse to worship it.
This is interesting. Once again, I'm caught in this past versus future.
Mm-hmm.
We say a lot of this stuff is way back when, which makes me think these things aren't going to happen anymore. But they are going to happen.
Well, there's the post-millennial viewpoint is the idea, or sometimes called the preterist viewpoint, is that these things are describing stuff that already happened in the past. But I think that we can also recognize that the word for breath is also the word for spirit in Greek. So who tries to put some kind of a spiritual reality into things that are truly false? I would say that's true of every other non-Christian religion, right? Buddhism talks about this spiritual migration of your soul. You can escape reincarnation if you live a good enough life, right? And then Mormonism, you can become a god of your own planet. Gnosticism, it was a belief in the 2nd century that was starting to come into vogue, and so the idea that the spiritual is good but the physical is evil. And so they didn't like anything to do with the idea of a religion where God would become a human like Jesus, right? so they didn't believe that Jesus was really God.
So back to what Chris was saying, the amillennialists say that all of it is symbolic.
Well, you have to understand it in the according to its genre. So there is mostly some symbols used in apocalyptic literature, but the word for war, like if you say something, if there was a war on Earth, I mean, that doesn't have to be a symbol. It can still be literal.
Right, but I guess all that symbolism, what's it for?
And well, because it was written as a kind of a way of keeping the book away from the understanding of the Romans, and it was because it was written to a specific audience, and the audience was early Christians.
Okay.
So they would read it and they would say, oh, we know the story of Daniel and how Daniel was fighting against the false images, and this is the type of thing we see in Rome doing the same thing. So Babylon represents Rome. The statue of the beast is the image that the Caesar made people bow down to, and even though you could describe that symbolically for things that happened then, it also continues to be true today. And there are some religions that actually have statues, but then there are a lot of religions that just turn an ideology into an idol, right? So idolatry doesn't have to be like a physical thing, but it's certainly true that that other religions that are false try to give breath or spirit into a so-called image that's really part of the beast, right? So religious authority claiming divine authority to be worshipped, when in fact it's actually Satan who's doing it. And Satan is trying to mislead people to not worship God, and then the true God shows us his nature, which is love, by sending his son to be the sacrifice for us. So God doesn't have to force us to worship him. Whenever worship is being forced, it's often the first sign that it's demonic.
So is there past and future?
Yeah, normally I describe that, it's like both ands, right? So just like prophecies in the Old Testament, they describe something that was true for the lifetime of the hearer, but it ultimately is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So that's a typology, right? So in a way we could say that if Old Testament prophecies were often typologies, then certainly the book of Revelation can be a prophetic in the same way, where it's pointing to something that's happening for the first century Christian, but then for us as well, because it's still seen in our lives today when people who refuse to bow down to, you could say the image of, if you don't refuse to worship the image, what image would that be? Well, it could be the image of, political correctness, right? And maybe it's not being killed literally. Some places you could be killed. Like I know that people who evangelize for Christianity in India, you can be arrested, and often people riot and kill people who try to evangelize. So if you're standing up for Jesus, you can die for that. In America, you might lose your job, you might lose your reputation. And some people have been assassinated for things that they stood up for and believed about Jesus as well. So this kind of stuff is still literally true even in our world today. Okay.
We need somebody to go in through Revelations and tell us what these words, the different meanings for these words, like breath being spirit. That makes a lot more sense to me. I'm looking for this guy
Yeah.
who's going to be breathing, and it ain't going to be that way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something that that's why it's important to have either a study Bible or when you do a Bible study on. It's possible, even if you can't read Greek or Hebrew, to be able to. You can do a word study by looking at the. There's a. Yeah, on the internet you can read the. There's a Bible concordance called. What's the name of that?
Net Bible.
No, the. So you can go into like Bible Gateway and look at the King James Version, and then click on the button that says Strong's Numbers, and then what it'll do is it'll give you the number for every word in the Bible. And so if you click on that word, it'll show you where that same word is used throughout the whole Bible. So you can do word studies. And then if you look under the definition, it'll show you the transliteration of the Greek or the Hebrew word, and then it'll tell you what it means. So that's a way of doing a Bible study without having to know the original languages. So it would tell you that the word breath is also the word for spirit. And when I was reading this, I was thinking, remember, a lot of the stuff in this section is the beast of the earth is imitating the true God, but he's not the true God. All he can do is imitate. So what did the true God do when he made Adam and Eve? Well, he created Adam out of the dust of the earth, but he wasn't alive until he breathed the breath of life into him. So here we got this false God, the beast, who is using the breath that's through this statue to try to fool people. So it's not able to make it alive, but it seems lifelike, but it's only mimicking it, right? So it's always a parody. It's always a false imitation that is never up to what God actually can do. So God can make people alive with his breath, but the devil can only try to fool people with some kind of a spiritual, mimicry. Okay, verse 16.
16. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead.
So this is that mark of the beast that people talk about, and so it's describing people of different socioeconomic levels, right? Small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive the mark on his hand or his forehead. So is this a mark that's literally something you can see? If you think about how it talked about that the mark of the Lamb was on the forehead of the believers, right? And let's see, that was back in the seal of Christians in Revelation 7 verse 3. And what is the mark of the Lamb? Is it do Christians walk around with, it says that the name is of those who are sealed with they're sealed with the name of the Lamb. So we have Christ's name on us, but it's not something visible. It's not like it's tattooed on us.
Right.
What does it represent though? When is the sign of being a follower of Christ? Yeah, it's through our baptism. And so the pastor will normally say, receive the mark of the cross on your forehead over your heart to mark you as one redeemed by Christ the crucified. And then we pour the water on the forehead. And so the baptism is not a visible mark, but it's a mark that claims us as one who belongs to Jesus. So here we've got,
Through baptism?
what was that?
Is that only through baptism?
Well, you could also say that your name is written in the book of life if you believe in Jesus. So even if you're not baptized, like the thief on the cross was saved. So in essence, he had the mark of the Lamb, but it wasn't through his baptism. So in a way, it's good that it doesn't specifically tell us the mark of the Lamb is baptism. But it does tell us that we are marked by belonging to Jesus, and that normally that's through our baptism, but through faith, we could also be considered to belong to the Lamb. But you see that this is another one of those imitations. So if Jesus marks us through our baptism as belonging to him, the beast wants to do the same thing. He wants to mark those. Here, if you don't have the mark on your forehead or on your right hand, then in verse 17 says, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark. So there's all kinds of speculation about what this means.
But it's very visible. It's like
Well, I don't know if it's a visible thing. It doesn't have to be a visible thing because baptism is described as a mark that's not visible. So this one could also...
It sounds like it's visible. It's an identifying mark so that other people will be able to judge you based on that
Yeah, well,
mark on your
I've heard that the description is like for the thing on the right hand. Did you know that some people are actually getting a microchip in this little section between your thumb and your forefinger, right in here, that can allow you to swipe credit cards, open electronic doors, and do all kinds of stuff. There's people who, actually allowing themselves to be chipped so that they can do these things. So some people call that, oh look, that's the mark of the beast. I think that could be used as the mark of the beast. But then there's another thing, like in China, they have a thing called a social, I don't know specifically what it's called, like
score.
social score. Yeah, it's a social score that whenever you disobey the government, so they have cameras that watch you, and they can do facial recognition. They also can identify you from behind because the computers now can judge who a person is by the way they walk, their gait. So you can identify a person by the way they walk. And so if you cross against the light, then you'll get marks down on your social credit score, so that you won't be able to take out loans. You won't be able to get driver's licenses. So it's by forcing people to obey the government that causes people to lose social score if they don't listen. And this could be used for all kinds of stuff. And I've heard that this is the very thing that world governments and maybe America someday will fall into. And some people say that's the mark of the beast.
It's a social credit system.
Yeah.
That's what they call it in China.
And especially for communist countries, it's for control.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and so definitely, all governments like to control, and unfortunately, some more than others. And this sounds similar to those, but those are not marks that are visible. So I think that it could be either one, because the word there for sign or mark, it can be translated as a tattoo or a branding. So those are obviously visible things, because the practice in the ancient world was that a person who was a slave was marked so that you can see who you belong to. And this is even done today, like in Brazil. My wife talks to me about how people down there, they proudly display the fact that they belong to an entity. So there's people who practice white magic, and they have tattoos that mark them as one who belongs to a demonic entity. And this is something that is acceptable in a place where a lot of syncretism has occurred, because a lot of African religions were imported during slavery, and so even to this day, people still practice these things openly. The Catholic Church has all these saints, but these other groups that practice a type of religion that they actually worship the saints, but the saints are the symbols for the demonic entities that were imported by the African slaves. And so they'll do like a witch doctor stuff on the steps of a church, a Catholic church in Brazil. The priest will come out of the church and he'll sprinkle holy water on the witch doctor, and the witch doctor will offer some chicken and as a sacrifice, and then they'll shake hands and they'll do their thing. And it's so demonic, and yet it's acceptable in that country by lots of people. So
all this is only happening in John's vision, right?
well, the vision is a picture of what is to come. So
he's been given a vision, but it's not like there are people getting marked physically.
right. Well, that's why I was saying that it could be either one, right? It doesn't primarily mean that's a visible mark, because, like I mentioned from the passage which
Well, in any
described
case, it didn't happen,
Jesus.
Because it's just John's vision. He's telling a story.
Okay. We can, if we look at it from that perspective, then sometimes that's the post-millennial view, is that everything in here is symbolic, and nothing in the future it's not telling us about the future, right? So that's one way of talking about it. Premillennials say that everything in here is actually going to happen the way it's described in the future. So you got these two opposites, like, it's completely symbolic, and we're not going to actually see any of these things happen. And amillennial view means that it's that there's a lot of symbolism that can actually describe real world events. It's just that we don't know which specific events those might be.
Yeah, I lean that way. I don't.
Yeah, well, that's the traditional view. Amillennial view, it just means no millennium, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean it's all symbolic. It simply means that you have to put it in the perspective of what is it teaching us about Jesus' return, because the millennium is from the time of Jesus' resurrection until his second coming. So obviously it's been more than 1,000 years, because the 1,000 years is that representation of the perfect amount of time of Jesus' rule. And his rule is not in the governments, it's in the church. It's in the hearts of people who believe. Okay.
Yeah, so amillennialism says that the 1,000 years starts right when the church starts.
Right, when
And
Jesus
comes
rises
on
from the
the-
dead.
And then postmillennial is, it's in the future. There's gonna be 1,000 years sometime right before the end, right before Satan's season.
Right, so, well, they say that Jesus' second coming is after the 1,000 years. So, and the 1,000-year rule, and so they think of
Oh,
the
yeah, you're right.
1,000-year rule is representing the church age during the time of the apostles only, though.
Oh,
So once the apostles died, there was, that part that was over. And then the premillennials say that Jesus will return before the millennium, rule on earth, before he'll take Christians out. The rapture will happen. It'll be a secret return, though. And then the 1,000-year rule, and then Jesus comes back a second time. So it's a second coming.
visible
Yeah.
return.
Right, so you got the invisible coming and then the second coming, right? Or it's his third coming. And that's the rule to judge. So that's why there's confusion. I've already talked about that. Actually, when we get to chapter 20, that's the chapter on the millennium, and we'll talk more about it then. But the church has traditionally, so this is like the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, and actually most churches up until the 1800s, premillennialism caught on with the Scofield Reference Bible. So that's something that's more of a modern interpretation that is not traditional.
It's on page 45, Chris.
In the CTCR book. Yeah.
There's a reference to Ezekiel in here.
Okay.
I wonder what Ezekiel says.
Oh,
38 to.
Okay.
There must be two
Well,
chapters, 38,
let's try to finish up we only have a couple verses left here, so. So the buying or selling, it can't be done without the mark. If you think about the control that governments want to have over religious people, in the ancient world, Rome tried to force Christians to worship the emperor, and so if you were marked as a Christian, then you were ostracized. So that was a type of the inability to buy or sell. But it's really talking about the livelihood. You won't be able to support yourself in a society that forces you to worship the beast, and if you won't do it, then they'll take away your ability to take care of yourself. And it doesn't say that God's going to rescue Christians from the type of persecution when governments try to force us to worship something other than God. So there will be persecution, and Christians will be persecuted. They are being persecuted now, and they will be in the future. But then the very last part it talks about the number of the beast, and then verse 18. We'll finish off with that. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. Now, what in the world does that mean? Right? And so, yes, right. So, a lot of people. Okay, there is a practice called gematria, which means where some languages don't have numbers. What they do is they use the letters for numbers. So Greek and Hebrew are both languages where the numbers are letters. So if you take the letters, the letters that represent the number 666 in Greek, what would it spell? Well, it doesn't spell anything that we can think of, but over the centuries, people have said, well, the evil emperor that was causing all these problems, that was Nero, but Nero's name in Greek letters actually adds up to, I think, the number 1005. So, but then it's interesting, in the first century, some people came up with, they said, but if you take the name Nero Caesar and you translate it into Hebrew, the Hebrew letters Nero Caesar add up to 666. So that was kind of, that's like, doing some theological gymnastics in order to make it fit what you think it should be. But I think it was meant to be something more general. For instance, what's the number of perfection? 7. So anything less than 7, usually when you talk about the number 6, it's a number that falls short of perfection. So that's why the number 6 represents evil. And then remember, from a Semitic or a Hebrew perspective, whenever you want to make something a superlative, you triple it. So the angels in Isaiah 6 call God holy, 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 which means he's the holiest. So the number 6 represents the number for evil, falls short of perfection, number 7. So you triple it, and it means the most evil. So this is the beast that is the evilest. So it represents Satan on earth, but it says it's a man's number. So who is this person who represents the beast on earth? Anybody who does things that leads people away from Jesus and away from worshiping God falls into that category. So I think it's really to be more generalized, so that we have there was Hitler and there was Stalin, there was Nero. Lots of examples in history, and even the Pope, especially in the Middle Ages, which was leading people aside. So these are things that are still true, because if we try to say it's only this, or this is the only thing I think it could mean, then we're cutting ourselves off from seeing it play out in every age. Because what happens if Jesus doesn't come for another 1,000 years? And then once we're in heaven, we'll look back and say, well, we weren't right that so and so was the number of the beast, because then there will have been other people in history that would have fit that category. So it's to help us to be warned.
My Bible says some manuscripts say 616.
Yeah, well, that's because there are manuscripts that when they're copying them, sometimes the copyist made a mistake. So the majority of the copies say 666, and there is a manuscript that says 616. And then some people have said, oh, but now if you take that number, it could spell a different word. And then they think that might have been the original because it fits somebody else's name that may have been one of the emperors during the time. Because, there wasn't just Nero, but there was also Vespasian and Domitian. So I don't know which one of those might fit the 616.
Wasn't Caligula?
Yeah, oh yeah, Caligula was also another one. So we're not sure who it might be, but various schemes of decoding the numbers end up with names like Euanthus, Latinus, Nero Caesar, and Domitian. But another way of thinking about it is the 666 is the trinity of evil. It's the imperfection, because each digit falls short of the number of perfection, 7. So we don't have to look far to find evil. We just look around and see it's still alive and well. But ultimately, Jesus is in control. And we'll see in chapter 14, really kind of the answer to the evil beasts is how the Lamb is still in control and will save us. So we'll stop here and continue next time.